those of us to think about the Torah, what it says, and to reinforce our own beliefs and how we live our life.
Of course.
And that's what it is
What's
to me.
better than that?
No.
Yeah.
The Parsha part I understand.
Well, this goes very quickly. We did the 5 books of Moses in 3 weeks.
Oh, that is quick.
All right.
Yes.
You get what you need to. I guess. All right. Okay, now we have more faces and more names that I do
Yes,
not know.
yes,
So,
yes.
I'm going to go around. There are actually more Eds now.
Uh,
You're probably sitting in the wrong place.
Michal, smart.
Yes. Okay, so let's start here. Do so Audrey, right?
Mhm.
And Marilyn, and then your name, Carol. Sorry? Tamar.
Doris.
Doris. Marcia. And Suzanne. Right. What's the-
Suzanne.
Suzanne.
No,
Sorry. No,
That's
no
okay,
idea.
no problem.
Okay. All right. I'm going for these. We'll try.
It's good.
Doris.
No, that's all right.
Doris, right?
You used to have
We
those
only
great
have to
little
remember
name tags.
one.
What happened to the name
I don't
cards?
know. The box, there's a box.
I loved that when I first came to teach.
Well,
We
because
should get
it
them
has
out
the
again.
name in front of you.
Yeah, it's
And,
very
It's all
helpful.
right. It's all right.
Next year, we'll get them back again.
I'm Naphtali.
We only have to remember one.
As well. Try to remember each other's also, but I mentioned you've met before. I'll just give my very brief bio, and I'm an ordained rabbi, but I'm not a practicing one. I have my ordination from Yeshiva University. For 1 year, I served as the rabbi of the Israel at Stanford, and that was the end of my rabbinic career. That was 4 years ago. And now I live in Stanford and have 2 children. That's what I can say about myself. Okay, so the book of Samuel is obviously divided into 2 books, as you know. Samuel himself, or Shmuel, the prophet, is not a player in the second book, given that he is no longer living, right? So the fact that the book bears his name is interesting. It implies a certain continuity between these events, the events that start in the book of, the first book of Samuel and then follow in the book that comes after. But there is really a major character who defines this book from beginning to end. Right? Even the most passing familiarity with it, you'll note that this is really the story of King David. It's interesting to me that King David is, we've got 2 kings here, right? Last week, we heard about the story of Saul, and Saul is the first king in Israel. Of course, the case can be made that Moshe really acted in a way that was sort of analogous to a king, that Yehoshua had many of the same powers as a king, but there was never a formal coronation until the days of Saul. And Saul, has his reign. You'd say perhaps it doesn't go very well, would be a fair way of describing it, unless somebody wants to voice a different opinion. Otherwise, it ends, of course, with him falling on his own sword and losing the battle. He's control of the king. He's got a usurper. In no sense would you call this a successful reign. And so Saul takes up the bulk of the first book of Samuel, and then we have the story of David in the second book of Samuel. And then we have got 2 books of kings and lots and lots more kings, right? It goes on for chapters and chapters of David here. And, then we find out, about things like Asa, Jehoshaphat, who, reigned later farther down the line. We know very scant details of their life. But of course, it implies that the life of David, the framework that he sets down for what it means to be king in Israel, is vitally important. Did I distribute these papers?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And so it's worthy then focusing, I think, principally, since the contrast between how he lives, in terms of how the Navi describes it, the prophet describes it in his life, and the personal details of other kings are so, there's such a manifest difference between the way the prophet relates to them. It's of course worthy of focusing on those details, the details of his personal life. What did it mean to be David? And so I think that probably the right way to do this, to get a sense of what the book is talking about, is to really move through several verses very, very quickly, but focus only on a couple of them when we get to them. So let's start right at the beginning, because the first taste we get of David as king, and it's king meaning reigning solo without Saul, is of course when he finds out about Saul's death. And so start at the beginning, if we could, and see how he speaks first. If we're going to call this the book of Samuel 2, it's a fine name. We could easily call it the book of David, and then we probably get more to the heart of the matter. So David is told, if you remember the story, right, so last week that Saul was in a war and was killed, not in battle, but of course, his gesture of non-surrender. So the news comes to David that he has been killed. And so let's go to the very first chapter of the second book of Samuel, and go down to verse 9. So a messenger comes, an Amalekite, interestingly enough. The story of Amalek, they are sort of the mortal enemies of Israel. And he shows up and he tells David that Saul's dead. And he congratulates him. So, you're good now, right? So here's how David responds. Go to verse 9. Somebody to read. I guess one of the red lines. So, Mary, okay.
After the death of Saul, David had already returned.
So skip down to verse 9.
Oh, verse 9. Okay. Then he said to me, "Stand over me and finish me off, for I am in agony, I am barely alive."
All right, so this is the messenger talking. He says, David wants to know what happened. So he says, Saul asked me to kill him. Go ahead.
So I stood over him and finished him off, for I knew that he would never rise from where he was lying. Then I took the crown from his head and the armlet from his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord.
Okay, right? So he says, look at this. I brought you the crown. Aren't you proud of me? Right? I killed your enemy, Saul. I mean, it's fair to read it if you have a cursory knowledge of the events that transpired between Saul and David. David spends a good number of years running away from Saul, who's after his head. And so he says, I've taken care of your enemy, and I brought you his crown, right? Not his head, per se, but I brought you his crown, and here it is for you. Now skip a couple of verses again, go down to 13. Skip.
Okay, yeah. David said to the young man who had brought him the news, "Where are you from?" He replied, "I am the son of a resident alien."
There it is.
Got that again.
Yeah.
An Amalekite.
Comes up all over the place. Skip a verse, go down one more, 15.
15?
Yeah.
Thereupon David called one of the attendants and said to him, "Come over and strike him." He struck him down and he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I put the Lord's anointed to death.'"
Okay, great. What does David do here? What was his reaction to the news?
No.
He was horrified.
We're going to see in a second that he sings a whole elegy. I won't actually
Yes.
read it all, but he goes on to sing a lament for Saul. Right? Now, the Amalekite comes and he says, "I killed Saul. Aren't you proud?" And David says, "Who do you think you are?" And he says, "I'll tell you who I am. I'm me." He says, "Well, you are now dead." And he has one of his boys come over and chop off his head. Now, this is a gruesome little episode to start the book with, but it tells us a lot. Right? What do we get from this story about David? What does he call it? When he says, "You told me that you did what?" He says, I killed you. You deserve to die because you told me that you killed the anointed one of God. Who's he referring to there? Saul, his enemy, right?
Yes.
Who he knows from Samuel that Saul was no longer chosen, right? God is not interested in you being king anymore. So says Samuel to Saul, and then Samuel goes and anoints David. And David knows this; it's not a secret to him. He knows that Saul he was once anointed by God, but that ended. And instead, the new anointed one, and of course there can be only one, is David.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the loyalty comes across here, right? He says, you do not get to say, you Amalekite, you do not get to say who deserves to be king. You don't tell me that I'm king. God will tell me that I'm king. And God said that Saul is king. And for you to go ahead and kill him is not only murder, but also treason. And so, for that, you deserve to die. Now, that's not the only thing in the story. How does David arrive at the conclusion that he ought to die? Right? He says, of course, you're worthy of death because you killed the anointed of God. But there's a process here. Right? There's some steps leading up to that.
I have very vague understanding of it, but Saul fell into disfavor with God because he didn't completely destroy Amalek at the time he had the opportunity to, because he did, I don't remember who it was, I think he saved a child.
Save the king.
He saved
The God, the
okay.
king,
So
yes.
he said he gave, he felt bad for the king.
Uh-huh.
And this was totally what God did not want for him,
Uh-huh.
because he felt that.
Yeah.
So Saul never really finished the job that was given to him, and Amalek is still the
Yeah.
the enemy
Right.
of the people.
And of course it does him in, and the symbolism of this is not lost on anybody who's read these two books in combination. It knows that Saul spared Amalek only to be then killed by Amalek in the end.
Yeah.
It did him in terms of the right of his reign. I mean, Samuel says, you don't deserve to be king anymore because of what you've done here with the Amalek. And then, of course, it really strikes the death blow. But in both cases, it's really the indication of a failed tactic. There it was a failed approach to what it means to be king, and here it was a failed tactic in battle that left him wounded and dying on the battlefield. But yes, that's true as far as Saul is concerned. But David is not, I don't think, thinking that deeply about that aspect of it right now. Look what he does here. He asks some questions first. He interrogates a little bit. How did it come to pass that you know that Saul is dead? And he says, I killed him, right? Now, this is David, it's not elaborate justice, but it is justice, right? He acts justly towards this Amalek man. He doesn't simply kill the messenger. He kills the murderer, right? It would be easy to read this and say, David was very angry. He picked up his sword and he chopped off the head of the Amalek man. That is not what happens at all. He gets the entire story, and then who does the actual killing? Right? He does not act simply out of rage, as you might have assumed that he would. He's thoughtful enough to call over somebody else to do the execution. I'm not saying that this is pretty, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily admirable behavior. And one of the things of tension that we find consistently throughout the book of Samuel too is whether or not David is to be admired or if he's to be admonished for his, we'll call it, overexuberance in asserting his dominion. There are definitely different approaches that one can take throughout the entire book. But here we have David acting, and the very first thing that we see him doing in his now legally unique position as king, right? If we
Yes.
this is the very first moment he finds out that Saul is gone. As he's there taking the inaugural oath as for, right, Air Force One, his first act is one of justice, right? Cruel, swift justice, but justice.
What about the fact that Shaul asked him to do it? That doesn't factor
Well,
in, or he
it
doesn't give
relates
that
in a certain
credence?
sense to what we were actually talking about in the Parsha class. Why does Shaul get to do that? When does he get to forfeit his life? His life is not his to dispose of.
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's part of the judgment that
Yeah,
he's
It could very
passing
well
here.
be. It could very well be. Now, there's no allusion to that here in the Psukim. I mean, David doesn't say, it was God's life to take away. He says, you killed him, and that's sort of the end of it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that could, obviously, it goes without saying that he's holding him responsible for something.
Right.
If he had come and he said, Saul killed himself on the battlefield, you
Yeah.
can imagine that his reaction would have been different. Certainly would have had to use different words at the very least, right?
Right.
It's an important point. And it's certainly worthy of dwelling upon in the 20 seconds that we have to discuss this. So,
There's one left. Any question that would be raised by the people we want to make sure that everyone knows that though he was an enemy of Shaul, he is not for the covenant.
yes, right. And
Yes,
this, of course, has
right,
important
right.
political implications because the Shaul, even though he was not successful as a king, he does have followers. He has subjects, you should say, right? And there is an entire large group of people that we'll see in just a second who continue to rally around Shaul's son. And so, yes, it's very important for David, as a political step, as a maneuver, to not set himself up as the enemy of Shaul's successors. Very, very important point, right? Because you see here, you can actually read this in a totally different direction. You can see David as a political actor. You know, he's manipulating things in his favor. Even as he hears the news of Shaul's death, his first thought is not, what a terrible thing that somebody's killed Israel. It's, how can I make this work for me? That's the way you're reading it. I think that that's a very fair read also.
And he's also thoughtful about the whole thing, which
Right.
makes it better for me, because he thinks out the whole thing
Right.
and he decides how to act then,
Right.
not just act.
Well, even if the, as Mark always says, you save a life no matter what. So obviously Amalek is not in a, is not aware of the concept that life is most important. So seeing an injured man, you should be helping him, and even if you are not sure he's going to survive, you have to make the effort to help.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to read too much into the behavior of the Amalekite. He's more or
May
less
have been
anonymous. But
Dying
yes.
so badly.
Why, but in those days,
Well,
wasn't the idea
He
maybe it
couldn't
was
call
time?
911.
Put me on my list.
Yeah,
Yes,
Sheldon
he
did
couldn't
request
call
it,
911.
but-
The
right.
ambulance wasn't going to
It's
come.
pretty serious to kill the person who was anointed, because now David is anointed, and he has to be clear what a terrible thing it would be if
He
he
killed
were the
himself.
one.
Very
If he
good
were the
points.
one to
Right.
be
So again,
killed
we
to protect
can't
himself.
we can't easily find, right? If you knew this event without knowing the text of the Navi here, you would say, oh, we can find out all these other reasons why David is acting really in self-interest, and his sorrow over the loss of Shaul, his indignance that Shaul was killed, is all a ruse. And really, he's just thinking about what it will mean for him somewhere down the line. But I think that it's important to take the text in a certain sense at its word. And so, at the very least, the author of the second book of Samuel does not want to present David in that light. We are supposed to, I mean, there's always subtext, but at least the text itself gives us the sense that his feelings were authentic, they were genuine. And the very next thing he does is V'konein David at the Kinaza. He sings an elegy, right? And
Right.
that's David the poet coming out across also at the
Right.
very from the beginning. And so, yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say, and maybe it's a genuine assessment. But here the prophet gives us insight into his character, which is, I think, supposed to inform our opinion of him. And, you know, at the very least, we see him as being sad, right? If not necessarily, if not necessarily single-mindedly so. He may very well see that there are impacts that this can have on his own dominion. But yeah, I mean, you make an important point. I don't want to undermine this. So.
Before he puts this guy to death, he rents his clothes and sleeps and
Yeah.
Yes,
fasts and-
yes.
Yes, yes.
There's time.
First he mourns,
Right.
so then
But I
he
still
gets
have a
the
question about that, because I didn't mean it so much for himself, really, as for the
position.
of king.
Yeah.
And that has to be respected and honored.
Right. I mean, it is a good point that, you know, we're dealing here with what, you know, in terms of period could be something like Shays Rebellion, right? It's a threat to the nascent republic. You know, here you've got the whole concept, the institution of monarchy within Israel is novel. It's lasted for all of one king so far, and it lasted very poorly. And so the idea that the institution of monarchy should require reinforcement is actually pretty reasonable. But I don't think that anybody within that society would have said, "Oh, it's totally legitimate to assassinate a king." That's a step beyond saying it's unjustified for there to be a king. God should be king, or we should have a different kind of government. It's another step to say, "Oh, well, you know, let's go chop off heads all over the place." I mean, so I guess with the history of the world, of course, we do get to that point, but we're not quite in, you know, the 18th century of France here. It's a little bit of a different era. No guillotine. They still use swords back in those days. So the story here continues after that with some important characters. And you can see them on the list of characters here. I'll go see them. Oh, okay. We got to get to the second side of the page in order to get to the end here. So we really have to We have Shaul has a son, Ishbosheth. You know the word Boshet means in Hebrew? Shame, right? Humiliation. Ishbosheth. It's an odd name to give one son. Man of humiliation, right? It's a nickname, right? His name was probably Stephen. Names all over the place in the are very often symbolic. David, I don't know if there's an obvious symbolism in, but in so many cases, there are names which really more are placeholders rather than actual monikers. And so Ishbosheth is obviously one of them, suppose. And so Ishbosheth comes in, and he's the son of Shaul, and so he's appointed king. Which, he of course has got some support, but when seeing how he acts as king, some of his generals end up shifting over to David's side. This is a story that sort of unfolds here, where David eventually, when he's brought the head of Ishbosheth and is told that he has been executed, he acts again with indignance, but at that point his kingdom has been consolidated. So skip over most of that. Having now actually consolidated his rule, we can skip ahead to skip the story. It's difficult to do this. I mean, there's so many interesting stories here, but I want to focus on the ones I think are most characteristic. So we've seen a sort of a violent side of David. If you go on now, let's go to chapter 6. Yeah, chapter 6. So David has consolidated his rule. He's fought against the Plishtim, who were the enemies that cut down Shaul. He's driven them at least somewhat away, although they will continue to be a nuisance for a long time. And so here we are now in chapter 6. And so now there's a moment of tranquility. Having now consolidated his rule, he says we need to return in a religious direction now. Right? So all the political maneuvering, whatever was necessary to be done, has now been done. And so here we are. And David has a thought, and so he plans on bringing up the ark to bring it to Jerusalem. Let's take a look at the first verse in chapter 6. Let's go around, I guess.
David again assembled all the people of Israel, 30,000 strong.
Okay.
Then David and all the troops that were with him set out from Judah to bring up from there the ark of God to which the name is attached. And they ignored the posts and
Okay, so now having won a battle, right? Basically, he's now finished. I mean, this is up until this point has really sort of been the end of the battle with the Plishtim. That's now done. David has now totally supplanted Shaul. There's no more challengers to the throne as it is right now. Ishbosheth is gone. Avner ben Ner, who was a general of Shaul, is gone. And David has, at this moment, it seems, a loyal following amongst the entire community, the entire nation of Israel. And so he plans now to bring up the Aron, right? And how does it describe here? What is the Ark of the Covenant? It has a different description of it here. Enthroned on it, right? Now, what is that? It's an interesting way of describing it, right? The Torah doesn't use that description, right, to describe the Aron. Why would David use that description? Why would the prophet use it? Of course, right? He's likening it to a king, right? God is now, David having consolidated rule now says, well, if I'm king, God ought to be also. And the symbol of that, the throne of God, if I have a palace, God has a palace. If I have a throne, God has a throne. And we'll see David's desire to build an actual palace for God in a second. He says, we're going to take the Aron, the throne of God, which has the Kruvim resting upon it, which has the symbols of God's dominion on it. And now it is in good symmetry, right? Until this point, it's been somewhere else. We have to pay a great deal of attention to it. Imagine you discuss the story in the first book of Samuel where the Aron was stolen in battle again with the Plishtim. They brought it to their house of worship. I guess not. Move inside that. There's some interesting parallels, but we'll leave them alone. So he says he wants to bring it back. And so now they bring it up to Jerusalem. Lots of song and dance. Everything is happy. And then go down some verses here, and now we'll see David and his family relationships because he's a family man also. So skip down to verse 15. Actually, read 14.
David walked all his life before the Lord. David was girt and living faithful. Thus David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and blasts.
Okay, so great joy, right? As David brings up he's the king, God is the king, everyone is happy. And how does David show that happiness? He dances, right? A very enthusiastic jig that he does as he moves his way up towards Jerusalem. How many miles this course was, I do not know. David was a young man, actually the same age that I am now. So, he had some energy. He could keep moving for a while. So, here he is dancing his way up. Now, continue.
As the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David weeping and wailing before the
Okay.
Lord, and she despised him.
This is his wife. Daughter. Yeah.
Oh,
And so she sees him down there dancing, and she feels terrible about this. What kind of reaction is that on Michal's part?
I mean, it's a natural
A
reaction.
natural reaction. She's embarrassed.
Right, she sees her husband, she knows that the marriage was because of political reasons.
yeah.
And she sees him glorified and happy, and her father,
Is
her
dead.
His father's dead, but it's not over the father's death. I mean, it's
Not over father's death,
there's some
but-
time has passed since then,
Yeah,
right?
but,
She obviously knows how David reacted to her father's death,
Yeah.
right? And elsewhere, we do see that Michal is described as loving David. Michal
That
David.
she loved him.
She did
Yeah.
love him,
Yeah,
right? So even though
She was
jealous
jealous
of,
that of David, the joy for bringing the ark, the attention.
the attention that David was getting, and
Was
she is
given.
the
She was given.
was giving the ark as opposed to her. An interesting thought. Yeah, it's an interesting possibility that here she feels like he's never shown this side of himself to me.
Right.
Could very well be. So
how long was this after her father's death?
It doesn't really.
I think it's less than a
I
year.
didn't think it was
Maybe
that
she
long.
didn't know. Maybe
Uh,
she
Yeah.
later learned to love him. She loved him. She married
No, I
him.
think we see already in the book of, I think the first book of Samuel that she does something. Right? So
But I don't think it was even a year.
I
was it?
think it's less than
Yeah.
I think so. I don't
And
remember
I
the
think it
exact
was a
time.
very natural reaction of her. I mean, she was the daughter of
Okay.
Saul.
So she's upset because possibly because she feels like she should be receiving that attention, or
Yeah.
possibly because she feels like Shaul, her father, or maybe her brother or something, should be the one who's down there dancing with the Aron. Because what this is a symbol of course, bringing the Aron, bringing it all together, is something that Shaul never had. It's unanimous support of the people.
Right.
It's a display that God is at least an outward display that God is with them, and it's unbridled joy, right? The idea that David has the moment in which he can be simply happy in his position as king, is something that her father, not even for 1 second, ever had. From the very first moment of his kingship, he's hiding, right? And throughout it all, Shmuel notices and says to Shmuel, if you think of yourself as nothing, which of course he did, he says, Roshiv Te Yisrael Ata. He has to constantly be reminded that he's the king. And David is so natural in his position as king, right? He just falls right into it. It makes sense for him. It's something her father never had. So jealousy, you think, in a certain sense. But you're not going the direction which is, I think, one which certainly could go, which is that's the most easy direction, that he's humiliating himself, right? This is her husband, and he's acting like a fool in the street.
If you go further down, verse 20,
Uh-huh.
it explains how she feels about it.
This is how she says it to her, right? And again, there's always two things happening: what she really feels and what she actually says. So the first thing we see here is V'tipos Labe, right? She is degrading for her to see him in this position, right? So actually read that verse if you don't mind, verse 20.
David went home to greet his household, and Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet David, and said, didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself today in the sight of the slave girls of his subjects, as one of the riffraff might expose?
Don't you just love that sarcasm, right? It's like, there's not too many instances of sarcasm in Tanakh where it's so harsh, right? didn't you do yourself? And my nichbad hayom. What a wonderful day it is for me to be the king of Israel, right? And how does David respond? So read one more verse.
David answered the father, it was before the Lord who chose me to save your father and all his family and appointed me ruler of the Lord's people Israel. I will dance before the Lord and dishonor myself even more and be low in my own esteem. But among the slave girls of these people I will be honored.
Okay.
Oh,
Right.
Exclamation points.
yeah, well,
Now,
No,
But
she's
also-
in the last line, isn't it?
Michal is punished for this.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
you can read it.
So to her dying day, Michal bore her a song.
Interestingly, the Talmud reads this in a non-simple way. The simple way is to say that she never had a child, right?
Yes.
It means her death. The other way to read it is that she died in childbirth, right?
Oh.
On the last day of her life, she had a child, which is how they do it.
Oh, to the dying day.
Right.
oh, right.
Yeah, it's a subtle read, and I don't think it's the obvious one. But anyway, what do we make of this story, right? So David here is acting in a way which makes sense to him, right? It doesn't make any sense to Michal. And he tells her that it doesn't make sense to her. He understands why it doesn't make sense to her. He tells her, this is right because God chose me. What is he saying? What's he getting at?
Well, he's not speaking very kindly of her father. I mean, if God chose him, he's implying, or it could be in her head, that her father was less worthy than
He
David.
says it, it's not implied.
I know, he says
Yes,
that. He
yes.
says very clearly that, but why? Right? Why is her father, what does he have that Shaul doesn't? What does he have going for him? That he targets something here that I think David believes is the really crucial distinction between himself and Shaul. Right.
What?
He says, I have the people with me, and not in some particular subset of the people. Right? Which people? The people's people, exactly. The imahot asher amarta. The slave girls.
Yes,
He says,
yes,
I
yes.
am the king of the lowest.
Yeah.
Right? I am a popular person who appeals to everyone down to the bottom. It's true, nobles might
Yeah.
be offended by this behavior. That's not my concern. Who else is offended by this behavior? He says, I am. Honestly, I feel stupid doing this, right? He says to her, Hayiti shafal be'enai. This is degrading for me also, but it's the right thing to do, because the right thing to do is to act like one of the people. It's not to be lofty above them. Shaul, for all of his good qualities, was too good, right? He was always on the up and up, David's own estimation here, and didn't relate to the people. And he says, God chose me because I can do this, because I was, I had a different kind of upbringing from the one that Shaul had. Yes.
But David was a politician and he was charismatic. And perhaps God knew that, and perhaps God felt that this is what the people needed at this time. Somebody that they could look up to, admire, and let someone rule who was, it reminds me of Bill Clinton, that kind of,
I understand that, absolutely.
and God knows everything, so.
But it's interesting, because he was only 30 years old.
I know,
Yeah.
I know.
He's 30, maybe 31 by the time you hit this story.
I know,
Right.
but he had something that God knew about, and maybe he felt the people needed that at this time. I don't know.
I think that's 16 years old.
Yes,
16.
he was young.
That makes sense to me. I don't remember the exact numbers. Precocious young man, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the experience of
He
being
had a
31 is
future.
something that I can closely relate to. And the idea of being king in that position is kind of daunting, honestly.
Yes.
But, here, David is a competent operator. Now, let's
Yes.
remember, though, this is a conversation that, as far as we can tell, is
It's
private.
private.
Right? Nobody else knows about this. How the author of the book knows about it is my question. I mean, it's prophecy, so, of course, there's always the possibility of revelation. But there's no sense here that David puts up a big placard and says, this is the conversation I had with my wife last night. I want everybody to know about it. There's no press conference that follows and says,
No.
if you happen to notice my wife's reaction, well, it's because her father was displaced as king and he's not good enough. There's no sense in any of that happens. This I think we have to read as an authentic reaction,
Mm-hmm.
right? When David thinks about himself as king, he thinks about himself as the people's king. Now, there is, however, again, going back to the point we made in the beginning, there is a sense here of correctness, justice in him being king. Why is he king and why is Shaul not king? Because it's right. He says, God chose me the tzavot et nagid al am Yisrael, to be the leader over Israel, right? And the word nagid, it's an interesting choice of a term. Nagid, it's not a very common word to describe a leader. The word nagid seems to come from the word neged, which means it's somebody who stands opposite the people, right? Everybody's on one side, and then there's the leader sort of, balancing them and standing not opposed to them in the sense of being, in opposition to, but opposed to them being on the opposite side of. So that's it's an interesting story on multiple levels. David's devotion to God comes across in it, his desire to have a symbol for the people to rally around, and shows that his dominion is equivalent in some sense and comes in parallel with God's dominion. And the fact that he thinks that he's doing this in a way that Shaul never could, it all comes across in this little anecdote. And now it goes on to say, I would like to build a temple. And he tells this to Natan, he says, look, everything is, all the pieces are falling into place here, right? It's now time to really push ahead with our great agenda here of establishing monarchy, establishing true dominion of God. He's pushed out the Plishtim. He's brought the Aron back into Jerusalem. He's unified all the people. He's got a unanimous following. Nothing like this has happened really ever. The closest you would ever get is in the dying days of Yoshua. And he says, now we're finally back on track. Nearly 500 years, 400 and some years have elapsed, where we've really just been sort of wandering, wayward, and now is the time to put it all together. And he tells this to the prophet, probably, and the prophet gets or Natan is told that it's not the right time for it. And going on, God gives a message to David. Go down in chapter 7 to verse. I'm not going to read it. He just tells him that God tells him that your son will build it, and he says, and your son will allow your dynasty to continue forever. Interestingly, the fact that in traditional liturgy, Mashiach ben David, the ultimate destiny of Israel is to have a Davidic dynasty restored, it's established by these very verses, which follow, of course, from the story that we just read. So it's hard for me not to see this as probably the most important story in this book, the most important positive story. All right. So, having now seen that, we go on to maybe the sadder part of it. David has many failures, without a doubt, right? He's had successes, but the successes come from, mainly, understanding what could be one of the people. The king who sees himself as aloof and aloft is definitely going to make mistakes. Everybody will, but there's some distance that allows him to a certain level of safeguard, where certain kinds of mistakes are not likely to take place. Here, David is not. It's not perfect. Of course, the most important story, the most obvious story, which everybody is familiar with, is the story of Bathsheba. And how the story starts is, I think, more important than how it ends. How it ends, David sees Bathsheba bathing, he takes her, commits adultery essentially with her, and then when she gets pregnant and knows that he's going to be found out, he sends her husband Uriah out to the battlefield to die. So it's all black on white here. There's no sense, even though the Talmud later goes on to say, Kol she'omer David chata eino el toeh. If anybody claims that David sinned, they're misreading the verses. It's very, 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 very difficult to justify that. Clearly, the plain meaning is that David has made grievous error here. He even goes on to say, "Chatati l'Hashem," I've sinned, right? I've done something terrible, and it's difficult to see that the other way. But I'd like to focus just for a second on how this story goes. It's chapter 11, I think. Yeah, chapter 11. So things are pretty secure here. Everything is going swimmingly for David. He's got functioning government. He's got no temple, but he does have a sanctuary for God in Jerusalem, and he has a capital and a unified nation. And then, there's always an and then in these stories. So, chapter 11. Tamara, if you, okay. Start with verse 2.
Late one afternoon, David rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful.
Okay, so, now, this is not innocence at this point, but it's not terrible. Kind of cute. right? He sees a pretty girl. David is, of course, already married, but the idea that the king would have multiple wives was sort of taken for granted. So, sees what he could easily imagine to be an eligible young maid. Okay. We should mention, I think, that it's relatively clear that Uriah and Bathsheba have no children, so she is very possibly quite young. We don't have any sense that she's been married to him for a long time. All right, go ahead.
And the king sent someone to make inquiries about the woman, who reported, she's Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, and wife of Uriah the Hittite.
Okay, so the first thing he finds out is that she isn't married. Now she's married to a Hittite, right? So simple reading, that means that she is somewhat intermarried, right? No, the Hittites are, the Hittite is one of the 7 nations that, the Canaanite nations that are supposed to be pushed out of the land. But at this point, we have no reason to think that there's any animosity between the remnant there is of the team and the people of Israel. So, interestingly, of course, his name is also Uriah, if that is in fact his name, which is a very Jewish name, light of God. All right. So, after hearing that, what does he do? So the right thing to do, of course, would be to say, oh, okay, I'll find somebody else, right? There's lots of pretty girls here in Jerusalem. No, that's not what he does. Go ahead.
So David sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him and he lay with her. She had just purified herself after her period and she went back home.
Okay. What's the relevance of that?
She's practicing.
Jewish law, it's from the
She's been to the mikvah. I mean, also, of course, it means that she's ovulating, right? Which is important technical background for the story, which is why she becomes pregnant. But interesting, right? The whole framework is set up as mikadeshet mitumata, right? She was sanctified when she comes into the palace. So the concept that David is acting, we might call it miserable, Caesar, and can't resist. That's not what happens. He doesn't run over to her house and climb up the ladder and force himself on her. It's different from that. Of course, he's the king, so it's not going to happen exactly like that. But clearly, there's some inquiry, right? First, he asks who she is. Then he sends messengers to bring her back to him. And then, upon receiving her in his home, it seems like, he tells us this. It seems almost like he asks, "Oh, have you been to the mikvah?" She's married, right? So he has respect for something, but not respect for her marriage, right? And so when David now, does this and now sends Uriah out to the battlefield to die, no doubt this is definitely a crime, but the crime is put in the context of a rather thoughtful person. To my mind, that actually makes it worse, right? That David acts knowingly. It's not, that he can't resist his urges, that there's so little time that lapses from the time that he desires her to the time that he acts on it, that, it's just a heat of passion. It seems to be that it's almost thoughtful, right? He says, this is a woman that I ought to be married to.
Doesn't in some way make him think that he's above the law? He's so special as king. I know you said he's king of the people.
Well, he thinks of himself that way.
Right,
Yeah.
so that, well, I could do this,
And
I
he-
desire this woman, and why shouldn't I have her?
Right? Yeah, right? Now, so he's above some aspects of law and not others, right?
Right.
If he is indeed interested in whether or not she went to the mikvah, so that means that he thinks that he's governed by something.
We pick and choose.
Interesting, right?
What I find interesting is I've always read the story that Bathsheba was taken against her will, right? There's no saying that she consented to this
No, it
relationship
doesn't. I
at
mean,
all.
she did.
She's
She
brought to
the
the
right?
right?
She's
She's
carried
brought
it,
to the
yes.
palace, and she's married to a
Yes.
guy we
Yeah.
later find is a pretty wonderful guy,
Yeah.
right? So like, what's going on for her? But what's interesting is if her husband's out in the battlefield, why is she going to the mikveh? And it almost suggests that she went in anticipation of coming to the palace to see David.
It's a possibility that I
Which
had
is
not
the first
considered.
time I've never ever considered that maybe she actually
I-
wasn't against this
But
relationship.
wouldn't she go to the
Would
mikvah
mix
because
with
it
no
was
matter
the right
where.
time of the month
Well,
of God?
I mean, but also,
I would think.
That's what I would think.
Not necessarily.
well, to be fair, in a world where Tuma and Tahara, where ritual purity affect more than just marital relations.
Right, so maybe it
So
had
it would have been
salience,
normal
right.
practice.
Yes.
For you to go to
Yeah,
the
Maybe,
that's what I-
maybe.
Right? What the
Yeah.
Mishnah implies is that during the time that there was a temple, even unmarried women would habitually go to the mikvah.
Mhm.
So,
Okay, fair enough.
But an interesting thought that the idea that she would be eager for his return, very interesting. I mean, the Talmud tries to justify David's behavior in all sorts of ways.
Oh, it does.
One of them, the more interesting ones, based on what Michal just said, is the intention that every soldier who went out to battle gave his wife a conditional divorce. It said, look, I might not come back, and they might not find me on the battlefield, so it'd be better off for you, rather than for them to search for my remains for years and years. Let's know that if I don't come back in such and such time, that we're divorced retroactively from this very moment.
So does he give her a guess?
So yeah, it does, right? And then when David arranges for Uriah's death, all he's doing is reinforcing the get that already existed, and so retroactively she was already divorced from this moment. She was single. It's not a.
She wasn't dead.
I mean, by implication, I mean he's called Hafiti. The Talmud is not comfortable with labeling him such, even though there is. He's Hafiti in terms of
Right.
cultural ancestry, but not religious affiliation. Yeah. So that's a it's a very apologetic read. Simple read is David acted very wrongly here, committed adultery, and then in order to justify it, he sends her husband out to die. And all of this is
Not now.
it's it's just that's it, right? It's not more complicated than that. Right. So the disciplined approach to kingship, which you would certainly expect from the king of Israel, is totally lacking in David. This is an enormous recrimination, saying that he acted so wrongly that he actually undermined the entire value of the monarchy. Because it's only worthwhile to have a king if the king is bound by some laws. The king who acts based on a whim is obviously very dangerous, and there's no reasonable system that would ever endorse that kind of tyranny. And so, by acting in this way, he not only offends Uriah, of course, and Bathsheba, but actually the entire nation of Israel by making himself an unqualified king. The entire moral code, yes.
I have no idea if you would have done this if died. She wanted
That's a good point.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, what he does at first, of course, is he tries to cover up the pregnancy by saying, "Get Uriah back here and let him sleep with her really quickly."
Really quickly, so we can have a 6-month child.
But it doesn't work.
When you think of today's politicians, maybe we should have this framed.
Right. I mean, the idea that sexual propriety, that desire and lust come along with death is something which, a theme that comes over time and time and time again. Are we supposed to stop at 11 or 11:15? 11. So then I'll just make this final commentary, and unfortunately, kind of like, maybe 15% of what we want to talk about here.
It happens.
The thrust of what's happening here, right, throughout the rest of the book, is that lust always follows death. I mean, is always followed by death. The next story we'll see is that David's daughter Tamar is raped by her brother, her half brother Amnon, and then Amnon is subsequently killed by Avshalom. Avshalom then sees David as an incompetent king and stages a coup. Then he, as an act of rebellion, takes his father's concubines, again, lust, and then Avshalom is killed in battle. And it just comes over time and time and time. I mean, just there's a theme that emerges over and over again in the book of Shmuel. It's not pretty. There's no question about it. And I think that a lot of this is intended to stand as a counterpoint. Is that we have this stark contrast between David as the king of the people, David who sees himself as one of the people, but then when you get down to David as an actual person, he's just a person run wild. And this is, of course, the tension that exists within the kingdom of Israel. On the one hand, you want somebody who relates to the people. You want somebody who is, with the Amahot Asher Amarta, with the maidservants. But if you have somebody who's too much like that, then they're unqualified to be king. And so Shaul is too harsh in one direction, David is too much in the other direction, and the hope going forward in the book of Malachim is that you'll eventually find the right formula. You'll find the person who takes both of these facets and can integrate them into a holistic monarchy. And you, unfortunately, the closer you get to Solomon, of course, but you never really strike upon it. There's always massive failings in every king in one way or another. that you come down to these two questions. Are they too far from the people, or are they too much in the direction of being one of the baser parts of the population? All right, I guess that's going to have to end our discussion of the second consent.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you, thank you.